Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a topic that's been grabbing literally countless sensational headlines globally. We're talking about the so-called Chinese land grab in Africa. We're going to be looking at some seriously rigorous empirical research by author Oluyomi Ola-David to uncover the actual truth behind all that panic. And let me tell you, her research completely reframes the narrative we're all so used to hearing. So we've got to start with the burning question that just dominates the global news cycle. Is China really buying up all of Africa's farmland? For years, the popular dramatic story has been that China is rapidly buying up vast tracts of African land to feed its own population. But as we navigate through her data today, we're going to strip away the emotion and look at exactly what the numbers tell us. Did she actually find evidence of a massive takeover? Or, is there a much deeper, more nuanced story going on here? Let's find out.
Section 1. Africa's agricultural growth engine.
Now, before we can even begin to unpack all the foreign investment stuff, she points out that we really have to first understand why land is so fundamentally critical to Africa's own survival and domestic development. Ola-David highlights in her paper that agriculture is basically the engine of the entire continent. 60 to 70% of the African population lives in rural areas, and they're largely dependent on low-productivity traditional agriculture for their livelihoods. This isn't just about farming, right? It's literally the foundation of their entire economic destiny. She notes that agricultural productivity holds the potential to boost rural incomes, finance further industrialization, and massively reduce poverty. So whoever controls the agricultural land fundamentally influences the continent's entire future.
Section 2. The Chinese land grab myth. Okay, so we've established how crucial the land is. But when we look at who is actually investing, her compiled data completely shatters the popular narrative. It turns out that boring old spreadsheets tell a much different story than those flashy media headlines. Get this. Over 30% of Chinese foreign direct investment in Africa is actually poured into the extractive industry. We're talking mining for minerals, drilling for oil, that sort of thing. Energy resources and heavy infrastructure are the real magnets for Chinese capital, not necessarily the farmland. And in a really stark, honestly surprising contrast, her data reveals that in a mere 2.5% of China's direct investment actually goes into African agriculture. Let that sink in for a second. Just 2.5%. For all the global panic about a massive agricultural land grab driven by food security fears, the empirical reality she presents is that agricultural investment is just a tiny, tiny sliver of China's overall footprint in Africa. And this brilliantly illustrates her core thesis. Chinese agricultural investments in Africa are completely insignificant when you compare them to their overwhelming presence in manufacturing, construction, and resource extraction. Out of the thousands of Chinese companies operating across the continent, only a tiny fraction are involved in green crops, cash crops, or livestock. Actually, her research notes that many of these agricultural ventures primarily serve the local African markets, rather than packing up all the food and exporting it back to China.
Section 3. Pessimism versus optimism.
To really understand the global reaction to China's presence, she divides the discourse into two very stark, contrasting camps. Acting as an impartial referee here, she presents both sides. So the pessimistic camp often views China's activities as this imperialist neo-colonialism, basically a resource scramble that uses trade and aid to buy diplomatic leverage and exploit weak domestic institutions. On the flip side, the optimistic camp sees Chinese involvement as absolutely crucial development capital. They argue that this investment can accelerate African growth, provide desperately needed infrastructure, and result in win-win scenarios, but only provided African states step up to properly manage it.
Section 4. Accumulation and dispossession.
Moving past the media myths about foreign invasions, she argues that the real issue isn't simply about who is buying the land, but rather the complex domestic mechanisms of how the land is transferred. She uses this heavy academic phrase, accumulation of dispossession, to define the very real social stakes here. What this means in plain English is that when large-scale land acquisitions happen, local smallholder farmers often completely lose their land capital, their property rights, and ultimately their livelihoods. She emphasizes that weak institutions and state-controlled land allocation can lead to local African farmers being involuntarily separated from their ancestral lands. And the state itself often plays a role here, facilitating these long-term leases to investors without any real social safety nets for the locals. Crucially, she points out that domestic roadblocks are what truly leave these communities vulnerable and limit quality agricultural investments. We're talking high literacy rates, poor basic infrastructure, and really ambiguous property laws. These are massive hurdles. For instance, her research points out that despite countries like Guinea having millions of hectares of arable land, factors like being landlocked and having weak governance just heavily limit investment. Similarly, structural bottlenecks in places like Senegal, think unreliable power and land insecurity, seriously hinder their overall competitiveness. Section 5. Forging win-win partnerships.
So, knowing these serious risks of dispossession and all these domestic vulnerabilities, how do we actually solve the problem? Well, she maps out a clear path where African governments absolutely must act as the architects of their own future. First, they have got to set up strong domestic institutions and clearly define property rights to protect their citizens. Second, they need to implement collaborative business models like joint ventures. For example, her research highlights these win-win scenarios where Chinese and local entities actually co-locate to share resources and reduce costs. And third, governments must demand technical assistance and technology transfer, like setting up agro-technical demonstration centers so that the local economy actually learns and benefits from the foreign presence, rather than just handing over the land.
The ultimate goal here is acknowledging these problems while actively managing the prospects for a mutually beneficial economic renaissance. It's entirely possible to leverage this wave of foreign direct investment to fuel structural transformation. But it requires deliberate, strong policymaking from African leaders to tackle these core problems of dispossession right head-on.
Section 6, the real top foreign investor.
All right, so this all builds to a massive, totally unexpected twist regarding who is actually acquiring African land. While the media obsessively focuses on China's state-led initiatives and paints them as the ultimate land grabbers, she points out that the land matrix database reveals a completely different reality, one that is happening largely under the radar. Her research drops the empirical data showing that India, driven largely by private sector initiatives, is actually the leading single foreign investor in African land. I mean, no way, right? This completely flips the established narrative. While everyone is so busy watching China, countries like India and even Brazil with its advanced agricultural models are quietly making massive impacts on Africa's agrarian landscape. And this leaves us with her final provocative thought. As emerging powers like India, China, and Brazil increasingly look to Africa for resources, the ball is firmly in Africa's court. Will African nations seize control of their own institutions, protect their vulnerable communities, and demand those win-win partnerships to forge a truly prosperous future? Or will they allow weak governance to result in a whole new era of dispossession? The data is clear, the solutions are mapped out, but the execution is entirely up to them. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope this deep dive into Ola David's research sparked your curiosity just as much as it did mine. See you next time.